Hi, this is Michael Moonbeer, and you're listening to KYRS Medical X Spokane 88.1 and 92.3 FM.
KYRS presents the documentary Sex and Broadcasting, a film about WFMU with Matt Groening, Lee Ronaldo, Pat Oswalt, and more. Thursday, October 26th, 7 p.m. at the Magic Lantern Theater, 25 West Main. $5 admission at the door. All proceeds benefit KYRS. Call us for more information, 747-3012. That's the KYRS Film Night at the Magic Lantern, October 26th.
You're listening to KYRS Medical Lake in Spokane, 88.1, 92.3 on your FM dial. Coming to you now with It's Long Waves with Gary Krug. The opinions expressed on Long Waves are solely my own and do not necessarily reflect the views of KYRS, its staff, management, or its underwriters. Well, hello, and thank you for joining me on this somewhat soggy Wednesday. Glad to have you with me again. I have been struggling to put together a number of ideas that account for a lot of what we're seeing in the world right now. And to break into this, I want to examine what's been going on with elections in the U.S., but also especially in the UK and in Europe, where in the last rounds of elections, we've seen the left, so-called, diminish in holdings, in power, in size, and finally in credibility in a lot of ways. I mean, just to unpack a little of this, there was a article by Neil Clark, a journalist who writes for a lot of places, but this was published on RT. Yes, that RT. And it's a rather insightful little article about, well, just laying out who won what in Europe. So let me start there, and we'll get to some other interesting bits in a moment. So let's see. In Austria, we have a 31-year-old named Sebastian Kurz, who's about to become the youngest world leader. And he led the Conservative People's Party, the OVP, winning 31.5% of the vote, which was the majority. Then we have also in Austria the radical nationalist movement, which nearly defeated the Social Democrats. The Nationalist Freedom Party took 26%, and the Social Democrats, who have normally been a very strong power in Austria and in Germany, were 26%, 26.9%. So the Social Democrats only edged ahead by 0.9% of the vote in Austria. And Mr. Clark points out that this is really striking because the Social Democrats have been a huge power in Austria. In 1971, 75, and 79, it achieved 50% or more of the vote. That's a lot. It was in power continually between 1970 and 1999. But since 2008, its support hasn't reached 30%. Excuse me. That's interesting. So significant declines there. He also looks at Germany, where the SPD had its lowest vote share since World War II last month, with taking only 20.5%. Right? And the Social Democrats taking only 20.5%. And in the French presidential election, the socialist candidate, Benoit Hamon, pulled in just 6.2% in the first round, which is the first time in the party's history that they didn't come in the first three. We could look at Spain, where the socialists dropped to 22% in the 2015 elections, their worst showing in Spain since the country returned to democracy after General Franco. Their worst showing. So, in Hungary, Viktor Orban has been in power since 2010, right wing. Bulgaria is governed by the center-right GERB party in coalition with a nationalist alliance. In Poland, the National Conservative Law and Justice Party rule. In Spain, the Conservative People's Party has held office since 2011. Belgium has been ruled by a center-right coalition since 2014. Again, I'm quoting here from Mr. Clark's article. The Netherlands, center-right's led an alliance since 2010. And in this year's election, Geert Wilders' ultra-nationalist Party of Freedom finished second, moving up in the rankings. And in Britain, we've seen the Conservatives, now led by Ms. May, in power for over 7 years. Even Norway, we all think of Norway as a social democracy. The center-right coalition won a re-election last month. And then, of course, we have Donald Trump and the strange formation of the hyper-conservative at times Republican Party in the U.S. So what's going on? Well, I want to propose that there are two basic ideas we need to examine here. The first idea is one involving immigrants. And that's a big deal. It's a big deal here. It's a big deal in Europe. It's even a bigger deal in Europe, in fact. But we've got to talk about immigrants and what exactly is changing and how this affects people. And the other thing that I'm going to have to talk about some today are the features of the neoliberal and indeed the conservative movements in terms of monetary policy and in terms of a imperialism. This is really not another good way to put it. So let's lay the blame for these upswings in right-wing and, let's be honest, totalitarian electoral victories where it belongs. It belongs at the doorstep of neoliberal and indeed neoconservative economics. So we've had, Blairism, which failed dismally, and we had Obamaism, which failed dismally. We had Bushism, or Cheneyism, I should call it, which failed miserably. I think I'm just going to a new word. And people, as a reaction, moved right, which is curious because the policies of Cheney in terms of imperialism, in terms of imposing Americans' impression on other countries, in terms of thinking of the U.S. as an empire, Cheney was almost as bad as Obama. Indeed, he was as bad. Obama just built on what Cheney and Bush and, to be honest, Bill Clinton, and going right back to Ronald Reagan, what all of them had started. Or Richard Nixon. Right? This whole idea of U.S. imperialism, I mean, as I've said on the show before, we've been at this since before the 1890s. So this is one bit we've really got to look at how these economic policies are affecting the world and indeed creating the migrants that we see, but also affecting the lives of people in their own countries to their detriment. Standards of living are dropping. In the U.S., everything is dropping. Longevity, education, wealth. I think we have hit the point now where 50% of Americans are below the poverty line. USA, USA, USA. Wave a flag. But the other issue, as I pointed out before, that we've got to talk about are changes in the social. Changes in the social. We really tend not to see the world in terms of the policies of the U.S. and the U.K. and most of Europe. Most people, I think, hear policies, and unless they're policy wonks, they don't pay a lot of attention to them. But what they hear is the news, some of it, the outcomes. And sometimes we even hear the stories of beginning to overthrow a country or a region. But of course we never call it that in the news. We talk about intervening to support democracy or some drivel like this. We tend not to see the world this way, but the policies of the U.S., the U.K., and most of Europe are responsible for economic migration and for migration merely to survive and have a life. Where did all of these people who are trying to migrate to Europe come from? It's no secret. Afghanistan, Libya, Iraq, Syria, and such places, all of which have been graced with the blessings of U.S. democracies dropped by predator drones. And this is not about us trying to make a better world. This falls right into the old pattern of colonialism, controlling the resources, controlling the oil, and making sure our people run things. So this rise of fascists and authoritarians in the U.S. and in the election of demagogues like Donald Trump, these victories are largely reactions of people to social changes and at home and abroad, birthed by these failed policies, which are based on theft, on misappropriations of other people's wealth, on subversions of democracy, and finally on a war to enrich the very few people at the top. Now, it is sad that very few people notice these policies when they're being presented. As I said before, the newspapers and the radio and the TV all talk about spreading democracy or stopping terrorism or some nonsense like that, or crushing socialism, as we hear currently about Venezuela, especially. Thank God the Trump administration seems entirely too incompetent to pull off any further interventions there, at least right now. But we'll see what happens. But getting back to the point, no one really notices until these policies come home, and they always do. The policies we applied in South America, in Asian countries, the policies we apply, in fact, in European countries such as Greece and Portugal and Spain and Italy, destroy the middle class. They reduce workers' wages. They siphon all the money to the top. And ultimately, as we're seeing in the U.S., they destroy the rights of citizens in response to the very terrorism that emerges from the consequences of this neocolonialism. Right? We destroy democracy in our own countries as a response to the very consequences that we created. When did all of this global terrorism begin? When indeed? In the 1890s, when the U.S. attacked Cuba and Puerto Rico and took them over, when the U.S. began an invasion against the indigenous people in the Philippines, inciting the Moro uprisings, in the annexation, isn't that a cute word? In the appropriation of Hawaii, and then making sure the Hawaiian peoples themselves would have no voice in their own governance. Right? This is not about creating democracies. It never is. Egypt elected a democratic leader whom we did not like because he was Muslim Brotherhood. But it was a fair election. So, we helped helped the Egyptian government put together a coup and remove him. And so now they have a dictatorship. Freedom on the march. And why are we doing this? So we can control the prices of things, so we can control resources, so that we can control oil, so that we can enrich American banks and American corporations who rely on this. And where we have to, we're quite happy to use torture, to use genocide, to use the destruction of entire civilizations, just so our corporations and our rich can have a little more money. You know, Zygmunt Bauman, one of the great moral philosophers of the current age, wrote an interesting little book called, Postmodern Morals, an examination of the whole issue of what is morality anymore. And he notes, Bauman did, quote, "The modern era has been founded on genocide and has proceeded through more genocide." We could talk about the massive genocides that took place throughout Africa at the hands of the Europeans in the 20th century, 19th and 20th century. Widespread genocides. Bauman continues, somehow the shame of yesterday's massacres proved a poor safeguard against the slaughters of today. Listen to the cries of Leopold's ghost, burning in hell for his handmaid host. Hear how the demons cackle and yell, cutting his hands off down in hell. So wrote the Illinois poet Vachel Lindsay back in the 1920s. Mark Twain also had some disparaging things to say about Leopold. But by and large, these things were swept away. Leopold II, the King of Belgium, would chop the hands off of African workers and their children if they didn't produce the amount of wealth for the Belgians that Leopold thought they should be producing. And we had German genocides and English genocides and French genocides and Italian genocides and, of course, American genocides. This country is founded on genocide. You know, people talk about the malaise that set into America after Vietnam. But Bauman points out, quite rightly, I think, the malaise in America was a result of losing in Vietnam, of literally getting our butts handed to us. It wasn't from remorse for victimizing the people in a genocide of over 3 million people in Vietnam, in Laos, in Cambodia, and Thailand. So we don't seem to learn from these. We refuse to see these genocides. And we shrug off these eternal wars that we're told keep us safe, when in fact they do no such thing whatsoever. They make the world more dangerous. They create more enemies. Every time. We're told, they keep us safe. They secure democracy. They provide, I love this, leadership around the world. But it's this very leadership, to get back to my earlier point, this very leadership in economics especially, primarily, over all other interests, it is this leadership around the world that many people in the industrialized world are beginning to reject. And this leadership is precisely what people in the developing world have always had to fight against. So let's consider what people are afraid of. Okay? Why is everybody so afraid? Fear permeates the air so much that we've even become numbed by it. We pretend we're not, but we are every time. Something happens in an airplane. Oh my God, terrorism. And of course, the newspapers play this up because it sells papers and it puts butts on seats and eyes on screens. And the government loves this stuff because it makes us want to cede even more power and more of our rights to the government. But the big issue for a lot of the people who are voting on the right is that they feel surrounded by strangers. Muslims, brown people, black people, Mexicans, people who don't talk the same language, who look different. And it's important, I think, to dig back into a little bit of this history. Historically, Bauman points out that an alien, someone who didn't fit in your group, could only enter the radius of physical proximity to you in one of three ways. They were either an enemy to be fought, or a temporary guest confined to special quarters, or they were a neighbor to be who behaves as the neighbors do. This was just how things ran through most of European development. Strangers were either enemies or temporary guests that you had, sequestered somewhere and were taken care of, or they were neighbors who were going to become neighbors who did what you did, behaved as you did. And Lewis Mumford, in one of his great books, The Culture of Cities, wrote on this topic. He said, the unattached person of the Middle Ages was one either condemned to exile or doomed to death. If alive, he immediately sought to attach himself, at least, to a band of robbers, meaning you had to have social connections to exist. You couldn't wander the world as one's own. You had to fit in somewhere into the communities. And a lot of people still live in this way. They think to a great deal in this way, that you have to have this physical proximity and this sameness, right? Behaving this way in order to be allowed in the society. In Bauman's thought, much of human neighborly connection was historically having the other literally in sight, having to share the same space. Right? And he writes, it did not rely on mutual trust, nor did it promise altruism or self-sacrifice. End quote. The physical neighborhood was marked by the absence of strangers, which led to a secure regulation of ideas and beliefs. Physical neighborhood was marked by the absence of strangers. Right? So everybody regulates everybody else. Your ideas, your beliefs, how you dress, what you eat, all of these. And Bauman notes that as such it did not require police. Right? People would police themselves, rough justice. People would punish folks who had broken the local codes. It also didn't require teachers. The community itself taught people how to behave. how to live, what was appropriate, what wasn't. And it would enforce all those necessary corrections. Now, the people outside the neighborhood, everyone outside the neighborhood was denied mercy, denied compassion, denied fellow feeling, or we feeling, or Ubuntu. It just wasn't given to them. Now, what happened with the modern age is we got this idea, or rather an ideology of community. And much of this was driven by the great industrial revolutions in Europe, in England, in the U.S., where there was an earlier version of great migrations of people. People who were pulled off of hamlets, off of farms, out of villages. And they went to live where the factories were, in cities like Birmingham or in New York or in Bremen, where the factories were. And this necessarily required people to live in close proximity with strangers and foreigners and aliens. It was considered, the Irish were considered aliens and foreigners even in England, even in the UK. They weren't considered even truly human. An idea that continued after the Irish migrated here following the potato famines. We should call it an English genocide of the Irish people, again, in the service of money. There was plenty of food. The English were simply exporting it and letting the Irish starve. So to continue. So these people who suddenly have to live in close proximity with strangers. And Bauman says this breaks the connection between space and connection with people. It's not about space anymore. The strangeness of strangers ceases to be a temporary breach of the norm, an incurable irritant. Strangers stay and refuse to go away. Right? They're not visitors, and they're not clearly enemies, but one cannot avoid them. They're socially distant, but physically they're very close. Now, I want to argue that this is the origin of much of the uncertainty and much of the uncertainty about identities of others, and thus the origin of much of the xenophobia and fear of the others, fear of the aliens that we see currently in the U.S. As you look at it, it's not a rational argument people have. It's a feeling that they are not neighbors, and they're never going to be neighbors. And there's no physical space that segregates them from the people who are already here. Now, again, what brought this into being? Where did these aliens come from? These are the displaced people from countries ravaged by imperial wars. Again, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya. Why are they showing up here? Why are they showing up in Europe? They're trying to move from the destroyed areas that had been their home for centuries, if not millennia. centuries. And now, in our infinite wisdom, we're picking a war with the Iranians, a people who have not invaded another country since 500 BC. But by all means, let's call them an existential threat to the U.S. because they still have two bricks placed one upon another. So these people flee their homes. They flee their countries. They don't do this because they want to come here and kill us. They do this because this is the only place we're not bombing or likely to bomb that they can get to. Right? There's no U.S. embassy here to conduct a war against us. So these people are seeking refuge in the few places available in the nations of their destroyers. And having come for that reason, many of them seek to maintain their own cultural continuity, their own cultural identity, their religion, their dress, their language. And they may tend to not assimilate, but to exist as strangers. And when they are treated like enemy, when they arrive, when they are demonized, they will naturally react as I think a great many people would. And they become the thing that we create them to be. So, it's not just people coming from countries that we've bombed and destroyed, though. I'm sure there'll be more of those. But this displacement occurs for the same reasons, but in a different way. We have people who are displaced by less commonly recognized, but no less destructive imperial depredations, which arise when we go about forcing small countries to export the greatest portion of their wealth to the U.S., to other predatory nations, and to corporatists. And this is the history of much of the modern world, particularly in Latin America. Particularly there. What is, when you get down to it, what is the history of Latin America? Why has it been so often unstable? Why have there been so many coups and revolutions? Because from the beginning of the white people being there, the wealth was taken away, given to kings, given to merchants, given to banks, and now given to corporations. Eduardo Galeano, in the preface to, actually in an addendum to his book Open Veins of Latin America, notes that the book has its roots in reality, but also in other books, which have helped us recognize, I'm quoting now, which has helped us recognize what we are, so as to know what we can be, and see where we come from, and so reckon where we're clearly going. The reality in those books show that underdevelopment in Latin America is a consequence of development elsewhere. that we in Latin America are poor because the ground we tread on is rich, and that the places privileged by nature have been cursed by history. In this world of ours, the world of powerful centers and subjugated outposts, there is no wealth that must not be held in some suspicion. What was the Monroe Doctrine about? After all, it wasn't about protecting South and Central America from Europe. It was about carving it out for the U.S. to give to its own corporations. Seriously. Galeano continues, the system has multiplied hunger and fear. Wealth has become more and more concentrated, poverty more and more widespread. That is recognized by the documents of specialized international organizations, in whose aseptic vocabulary our oppressed territories are countries in the process of development, and the pitiless impoverishment of the working class is regressive income distribution. Isn't that cute? Regressive income distribution. Take even more money from the working class. Give it to the rich. Galeano continues, the international Moloch machine has kept on grinding. Countries at the service of commodities, people at the service of things. With the passage of time, methods of exporting crisis are perfected. Monopoly capital reaches its highest peak of concentration, and international domination of markets, credits, and investments make possible the systematic and growing transfer of contradictions. The outposts pay the price for the prosperity of the centers. And hasn't that always been the way of capital? Hasn't that always been the way of slavery? The way of corporatism? Doesn't that explain a great deal of our own history and the history of much of the world? Galeano again. Do we not see who profits from the arms traffic, of which our country has provided sad examples? Do we perhaps understand that the militarization of poor countries' regimes is one of the consequences of economic and cultural domination by industrialized countries, where life is ruled by the lust for profits and the power of money? Now, actually, Galeano here is quoting the bishops of France from a pronunciamento they made back in the 70s. But he nails it. They nail it. Oppression becomes normalized. It becomes the infrastructure that destroys people, that destroys nations, that destroys peace, that destroys morality, that destroys goodness, that destroys fellow feeling. I'm going to return to this in just a moment. But right now I'd like to remind you that support for Long Waves comes from Stage Left Theater, 108 West 3rd Avenue in Spokane, featuring Back of the Throat from October 20th to November 5th. You can find out more information by calling 509-838-9727 or go online to SpokaneStageLeft.org. So, the migrants coming up from the south of America, Mexico, Colombia, Salvador, Guatemala, Why are they leaving? Because of the capitalist plague, fueled by the U.S., nourished by the U.S., destroys their lives and sucks all the money away. And when these countries are insufficiently grateful for being turned into hideous places, why then stronger methods must be employed. Galeano writes, dictators, torturers, inquisitors. The terror has its officials, just as it has post offices and banks. And they apply it because it is necessary. It isn't a case of a plot by the perverse. No. They apply it because it's necessary to maintain the control. Galeano, again, torture wouldn't exist in our countries if it weren't effective. Formal democracy would continue if it could be guaranteed not to get out of the hands that hold power. And some of these are local hands, to be sure, locals who benefit from these kinds of activities. But overwhelmingly, the greatest bit of it floods back to the U.S., to Europe, everywhere else. The people end up impoverished. Democracy ends up destroyed. Their economies are strangled. And so they flee. And they try to go someplace where maybe it won't be quite so bad. And then they get here, or to Europe, and they are the stranger, they are the other, they are the alien, with no rights, no protections, no sense of fellow feeling from a great number of people. In discussion of the overthrow of the Chilean government, the Allende government in particular, and the installation of Pinochet, millions of dollars. I mean, this was worked out by Washington, in Washington, by Kissinger and the CIA and all these people who worked on it for years. Millions of dollars were spent buying support. The same was done in Brazil against Goulart. The funny thing was, Lincoln Gordon was U.S. ambassador to Brazil. And he told a journalist later, Galeano recounts this, he explained to a journalist later, what the hell? That was more or less a habit in those days. The CIA would dole out political funds. In the same interview, Gordon explained that when the coup took place, the Pentagon had a huge aircraft carrier and 4 supply ships stationed off the Brazilian coast, quote, in case the anti-Goulart forces should ask for our help. That help, he said, quote, wouldn't be just moral. We would back them up logistically with supplies, ammunition, oil, and so on and so on. Or we will loan them money so that they can do development projects, which inevitably are performed not by the people who live there. They don't actually benefit. They don't actually get to build these things. You have to pay the countries that are loaning you the money to send their own people down there. And then when you can't pay it back, they impose austerity and make you give even more and more of your country away. This is the game. This is the game. And this is the source of all of these social problems we're seeing now. It's a perfect machine for the totalitarians, the authoritarians, the neo-Nazis. Perfect machine for them because it enriches them and their buddies, and it turns a lot of common people against the ones who have been most damaged. Turns them against the people who have suffered the most from this depredation. But all they see is aliens. All they see is aliens. Isn't that the case? You know, something funny happened in Peru back in 1977 when Juan Velasco Alvarado was overthrown and died. He'd been trying to do some good reforms for the Peruvian people. But the person who followed him, one General Hugo Banzar, dictator of Bolivia, said no amnesty for prisoners, nobody who protested, nobody who's in prison, nobody who was exiled. And then 4 women and 14 children came to La Paz from the tin mines and started a hunger strike. Quoting, "This isn't the moment," pronounced the wiseacres. "We'll let you know when." Doesn't that sound familiar? Oh, this is not the moment for that. No, we'll just talk about this later. The women sat down on the floor. "We're not asking you," they said. "We're telling you. The decision has been taken up. Up there at the mine, it's a permanent hunger strike. You get born and the hunger strike starts right then and there. And that's where we have to die, too. It's slower, but we have to die, too." The government reacted with castigations and threats. But the hunger strike let loose those forces that were long pent up. All Bolivia was shaken and showed its teeth. 10 days later, there were no longer 4 women and 14 children. 1,400 workers and students had gone on a hunger strike. The dictatorship felt the ground wobbling beneath its feet, and a general amnesty was won. That speaks to our own need. Divided, separated, talking about the wrong issues in the wrong ways, never addressing the core of the problem, the core of the cancer. Global capitalism, disaster capitalism, imperialism, unbridled capitalist expansion is the source of all of the world's major problems. And as a result of those problems, seeing around us only aliens and others, as many do, it's extremely difficult to build that sense of Ubuntu, we feeling, I feel you, that sense of compassion, that sense of mutuality, and the ideas that we're all in this together. And unless we come together and work and push and fight, non-violently, but fight to change the regimes, our own regimes, things are going to go from bad to worse, to worse, to worse. And people we elect will become more and more authoritarian. More and more rights will be stripped away. More people will become impoverished. More will die needlessly. More schools will continue to be shut down. More people will be unable to get health care. More people will live without a future. And I'm not now speaking of the third world, the developing world, so-called. I'm speaking of the U.S., the U.K., Europe. Look around you. It's already happening. We feeling compassion, unanimity. These are our strengths. These we must cherish and build. Well, that concludes today's show. I'd like to thank you so much for listening today. You've been listening to Long Waves here with Gary Krug on KYRS. And if you want to contact me, you can write Long Waves, 2 words, Long Waves at kyrs.org. You can find a sometimes updated Facebook page, Long Waves Radio. And I love to hear from you. I love your ideas. It's good to know people are out there listening. So please, let me hear from you. I look forward to it. And if you want to help out KYRS, there are 2 ways you can do that. One, you can become a member for $35 a year. You can become a member. We are largely supported by our listeners. $35 a year. It's not much money when you break it down, and it means a lot to us. Or if you can afford more, you can become a sustaining member. Simply go to kyrs.org, click the button, and you can securely become a member online. Another way you can help us is you can donate your car, truck, or boat. Running or not, we don't care. Just give us a call, 855-KYRS-CAR, 855-KYRS-CAR. That's 855-597-7227. We'll arrange a free pickup. You'll get a nice tax deduction. And we'll get some pennies to keep the lights on, which is always useful, especially for a broadcast studio. Anyway, thank you again for listening. I'll be back next week with another live show. And until then, stay smart, stay strong. Try to see past the alien. And try to see where our work really is cut out for us. You've been listening to Long Waves on KYRS, Medical Lake in Spokane, 88.1, 92.3 FM. Bye-bye.
The mystery of